Hello, and welcome to the Road to Autonomy Podcast. I am your host, Grayson Brulte. The Road to Autonomy Podcast is brought to you in part by Florida Internet and Television. It's time to cut the tax on tech. Hello and welcome to the Road to Autonomy. I am your host, Grayson Brulte. On today's podcast, we're absolutely honored to have Aarjav Trivedi, founder and CEO of Ridecell. Welcome to the podcast, Aarjav.
Hey, Grayson. It's good to be here.
It's good to be here. Aarjav, you graduated from Georgia Tech and founded Ridecell 1.0 in Atlanta. What were some of your biggest accomplishments during those years in Atlanta, and what did you learn from your time there?
Yeah, I love Atlanta. When we started, from the day we started, we sort of had this vision to help the world move better, right? I've sort of had a blessed life. Georgia Tech was awesome, and right after Georgia Tech, I got to work at a startup called Cipher Trust as a greenhorn, on this team led by Paul Judge, who later went on to start Pindrop, TechSquare Labs, is in SoftBank's fund. Dmitry Alperovich, who started CrowdStrike. And I sort of learned a whole lot of set of things from them, right? I had this problem, right? I grew up in Bombay, where I happen to be right now. And I learned driving here. And I love cars, right? I love driving. And the problem with learning driving in Bombay is, your muscle memory gets trained to just find the gaps. And so having learned driving in Bombay, I confidently bought, 1995 Saturn sort of sedan with the first $700 I saved. And then I repeatedly failed my driving test in America for 3 years. So I had this job where, I was obsessed with the mission. I loved it. We were solving one of the hardest problems in the world. And, I learned how that requires uncommon passion, focus, urgency. Mission obsession to this day is one of our values. But I had to wake up in the morning and wait for a bus, an average of 1 hour, because I was always waking up late and going to work at 11 in the morning. And then I would stay at work till 11 at night. And so once again, the bus ran once an hour at best. And so for 2.5 years, I had to take the bus. And it's horrible, right? Like, the feeling of being out in the cold, in the rain, next to this pole, right, for an hour, sometimes 2 hours, just hoping the bus is on time. And look, I was getting paid okay, but I was getting paid enough to be able to once in a while afford a cab. I had these people riding the bus with me every day who couldn't, right? So honestly, I did not, sort of grow up wanting to change transportation or like start a transportation technology company. But sort of 3 years in a row, this experience almost on a daily basis, it grinds into you sort of this feeling of like, there's got to be a better way, right? So I learned a lot of things, right? The first thing was it sort of, like lit this fire, of like wanting to change this fundamental thing in the world that to this day is, so much progress has happened by the way, but to this day, there's so much more we could do, right? And then, I learned so many other things, right? I was a first-time founder, did not know the first thing about starting a business. So many people at Georgia Tech and Cipher Trust helped me and mentored me, right? For no reason other than to help me succeed. And it really helped me, I had a great upbringing, parents who had taught me great values, but it really helped me understand how valuable sort of thinking true north is, right? Just trying to help people for the sake of helping them. And that's another of our values now, right? True north. And then what else, right? I met Arun there, my co-founder, Arun Kumar Elangovan, he's sort of this epitome of co-founders mentality. You never appreciate people, early on, but, what I learned from him, and just sort of to this day, right, is sort of this just willingness to take on whatever, any job, any role, whether or not it is in your job description, right, to further the mission. So I learned a lot of things. If you'll humor me for a couple of minutes, I could go on actually.
Was it sitting in the cold rain in Atlanta, and for our listeners that are young, in the old days, we didn't have apps or phones that told us when the buses were coming on time. You had to hope that the schedule was right and that somebody didn't call out sick or that the route didn't change due to demand. Is that kind of where you're like, wait a second, I'm at Georgia Tech, one of the premier institutions in the United States. I'm a really smart guy. I can fix this problem. Is that where the light bulb went off?
Absolutely. In fact, we had just built, the iPhone had just become a development platform. And, I couldn't yet afford it, but I knew it existed. And, as an engineer, you connect the dots, right? So it was like, here I'm waiting every day for the bus. Hundreds of cars are passing by me. Fundamentally, there's two things that could lead them to give me a ride. The very first thing is trust, right? And at Cipher Trust, we had just built the first, internet, sort of reputation system. And so I knew how to solve the trust problem, right, in my mind. And the second was payment, right? Like you should pay someone if they're going to drop you off at the train station. And I knew I could solve that on an iPhone. And so it just seemed like the solution was sitting right there, right? And this was 2008. Uber didn't exist yet. And so, like you said, in most parts of America, it was impossible to get real-time information on your bus on a smartphone. And so it seemed like a problem that could be solved in a relatively sort of well-defined way, and that would make such a big impact on everybody's lives, including my own.
You're learning how to solve the trust problem. You're learning how to solve the payment problem. And then as the company starts to mature, you moved to San Francisco and launched Summon, which was formerly known as Instacab. Why? What did you see? Because Atlanta has a great business community with Coca-Cola, Delta, Home Depot. What was the urge of San Francisco? Was it that you were an engineer that needed to hire more engineering talent to scale your vision and your dream?
That's a great question. Back in 2009 through 2012, right? Atlanta was already a great community, like I said, for technology, but it was very focused on a few verticals, security, for example, to this day. And most investors at that time thought transportation, or as mobility used to be called then, was a no growth industry, right? They just did not see the potential. To this day, I remember we had gotten profitable, right? We bootstrapped the company. Georgia Tech helped us raise $25,000 from the SBIR, which was the only money we raised, which was a grant. And then we bootstrapped the company to being profitable. We actually worked with, Coca-Cola was one of the early pilot customers. We worked with organizations ranging from CDC to MARTA. We convinced them to use our technology, to adopt real-time transportation. And even though it was hard, the lessons we learned along the way were what allowed us to create a lot of firsts later in the industry, right? My favorite value, the obstacle is the way. The idea that every single thing that seems like an unbreakable wall at first, when you break through it, as a lesson for you, sort of like a super mushroom in Mario, that came from that time. But it was honestly somewhat dispiriting, to be able to build a profitable company, but one that really was not making a dent, right, in the problem we set out to solve. And around the same time, in 2011, I went to a transportation camp in San Francisco, which was this unconference, and it was night and day, right? Like I met Sunil Paul, who later started Sidecar. I met Jay Nath, who worked for the city of San Francisco, and all these people, all they saw was possibilities, right? Government officers seeing possibility in technology was new to me. It blew my mind, right? So right then, it was clear what we needed to do. I had known Paul Graham through just sort of startup school. My wife and I actually took a bus from New York to Boston, just to get to the first startup school. So I knew that there were people there who believed in the potential of technology, but then to see that there were people there, including in government, who saw the potential in technology was what flipped the switch. So then Arun and I decided to move to the Valley. Our spouses, took 6 months longer, but but we applied to, we moved to the Bay Area. We applied to YC, Y Combinator. We got in. That's how the San Francisco leg of the story started.
And I want to point out something to the listeners that a lot of individuals don't know that's really, really important. Summon had a lot of firsts. Summon was the first on-demand taxi company in California to receive a permit and operate legally. Summon was the first service to combine taxi, TNC, community drivers, and limo operators into an app. Summon was also the first ride-sharing service to partner with a car-sharing service, BMW Drive Now. How were you able to achieve so many industry firsts coming from Georgia, new into San Francisco? Was it just this, you believed in possibilities, you had this passion, you said, if I put my mind to it, anything's possible? What drove that incredible innovation such early on in your career?
Yeah, it's sort of like those hockey sticks, right? Where the first many years of that are this flat chart, and for us, that flat chart was Atlanta, right? Even though we were making tremendous progress, we ran into so many obstacles. So to make that more specific, when we came to SF and we started this, a number of innovative companies had started, right? So Uber was there, but they were just doing limos. And in fact, there's a tasty, juicy piece of happenstance there, where when we first started talking to the city and the CPUC about getting a permit for ride sharing, Uber actually argued that ride sharing was illegal. So somewhere in the public record, I think is a case from someone at Uber that on-demand limos are illegal, but on-demand ride sharing is not. Anyway, so like coming from Atlanta, where people had threatened to put us in jail for starting an on-demand ride sharing company, and Atlanta, it remains an amazing place and has actually transformed quite a bit now. But the taxi regulators there were just traditional. to a place where the city was willing to take a meeting with us, that was a revelation for us, right? So our approach was very straightforward. We acknowledged from day one that the regulators had a legitimate job to do, which was in the interest of the public. And just that respect in the interactions and the productive aspect to the conversations seemed to help us quite a bit because, the other folks on the table at the time were not coming to the table from the regulators' perspective in a constructive way. So even though the city, eventually did not want to give us a license, the state did. And that's how we became the first legal ride-sharing company in the world, right? In terms of the combining taxis, community drivers, or ride-sharing, we've always believed that, there was this artificial demarcation at the time of, this is legal and that is not. And we felt that if everybody who had passed background tests, who was a good driver, could not, and who wanted to give other people rides, could not give that, we would never have liquidity, we would never have the convenience that we do now have, right? And that's where that came from. And then lastly was a very unfashionable innovation. We just did not see how the unit economics of ride sharing could work without, sort of improving the utilization of vehicles, right? And this remains a problem to this day. You can't pay your drivers less than living wage. So we wanted from day one to build a community of drivers who made a decent wage, and we did not want to depress pricing by paying them less than a living wage. So how do you reduce their cost? To us, it was obvious, right? There are fleets of vehicles. At that time already, BMW had 100 electric vehicles in San Francisco. The range was 90 miles, but we figured out a way to have these vehicles utilized by our drivers when they were otherwise underutilized. And that created an alignment where the vehicles got high utilization, BMW got more revenue, and the drivers, including those who could not afford to own a car in San Francisco, to park it, to insure it, could now drive, right, and get a job. And the moment we did that, we saw that this was the future, right? A future where you did not use one vehicle for just one thing, where you used the vehicle was available to whatever use case, deliveries in the early morning, people driving themselves to work if they want with car sharing, in the morning, people driving, being driven home, right, after the end of the day, or being driven to a bar or back from a bar. We saw that this kind of around the clock utilization of vehicles is how, transportation needed to function for it to be sustainable in every way. And so that was the basis of that third thing, right?
You're creating jobs, you're offering consumer choice, you're solving the fleet optimization problem. Is this where Ridecell 2.0 got its birth?
Absolutely, right. So, this is where Ridecell got its birth. In November 2014, right, we had a choice. We were the fourth largest ride-sharing company. We could just raise more capital, but we saw that there was this big gap where not only, car-sharing companies, but, logistics companies, Uber, Waymo would need software that helped them drive higher utilization of those vehicles. And it turned out that we had already built it, right? We had built the first jury-rigged version of that for ourselves and for our partners like BMW. And, some of the early folks at BMW, Pete Dempster, who's now at Amazon, Richard Steinberg, who leads Electrify America, and a unit there, they convinced us that it was worthwhile for us to pursue this larger problem of building technology that we felt, and they agreed, would eventually be used by the largest fleets. And they even became our first customer. So when we saw that we had two choices, one was to be, like the fourth largest ride-sharing company, very lucrative for us, potentially personally, but not as satisfying. And second was a longer road, but that aligned with our mission, right? Helping the world move better, even more. We decided to, shut down the consumer ride-sharing company and then, take the lessons we had learned to build a new platform that would be used by folks like BMW, like Google, like Penske.
I think it's brilliant because you took the core of it. You have the software. What Salesforce is for marketing, I'll go on the record and say Ridecell is for fleet optimization. You make a business operate profitably, just like Mark Benioff can come on here and tell us 1,000,001 ways how Salesforce makes corporate enterprises act profitably. And during that time at Summon, you built a really great relationship with BMW. BMW led your Series A round with 11.7 million. How did that relationship, first of all, the BMW say, hey, we might try a subscription service, or we want to try this new innovation, but we need a software platform. You have the platform, we have the cars and the cash. Can we get married? How did that evolve?
Yeah, actually, they believed in the ride sharing. Both Khosla Ventures and BMW invested, an initialized capital invested, along with a number of our angel investors in the ride sharing business. And then we used, they were one of the partners whose vehicles we were using for the ride sharing business. So the relationship started with their investment, a seed investment in the ride sharing business before our A round. But then as we discovered the problems they had, right, in managing this fleet and getting more utilization and their desire to, use these vehicles for more use cases, and they saw that we could help them with technology and initial tools we had built and the platform we later built was what they needed. It was the next gen platform. They wanted to be the first customer, so they took a bet on us, building, providing them with the next gen platform. They became our anchor customer, and as part of that, they wanted to lead the round because they saw the potential for a platform like this that helps, increase the utilization of vehicles with data, with automation, to transform, sort of not just BMW's fleet, but as you said, everything from the ride sharing fleets to the autonomous fleets of the future. So that's how that investment happened. Khosla invested again in the A round. I still remember Vinod said, "Look, do you think this is you're going to make a big dent in the world? If not, shut the business down. I'll fund your next startup." And I said, "No, I will. This is what we want to do, Vinod." So we pivoted and we started Ridecell.
And how is it working with Coastal Ventures? They've got quite the storied past.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I had a chance to work with Vinod a little bit, with Keith, with David Whedon, and I think that the thing is they what I find most compelling about my interactions with Khosla Ventures and their partners is they always pushed us to focus on the highest impact problems, right? We see sort of sometimes have this sort of archetype of always being focused on money, when the reality is it's one of those areas where incentives are pretty aligned, right? So most great investors, and Khosla is certainly one of them, are very focused on creating impact, because if you create the impact, the revenues follow. And I think that we've had a great relationship with Khosla Ventures, and I've always been personally inspired by the various partners over the years, including Vinod, including David, including Keith, who is now at Founders Fund.
And I got to just go on the record and say, Ridecell has some incredible investors. Today, you've raised over $145 million. You have a company invested that I used to work at years and years ago, Sony, which I think was the coolest thing in the world. And I saw the CES announcement with the car. I'm like, okay, I think there's something going on here. And you got Denso. You got the great folks over at Penske who do all sorts of incredible stuff. And then Cox Automotive. So you have all these great investors. You're the CEO of a global company operating in Europe, India, and the United States. You've got an incredible balance sheet. You've got talent all over the world. As a founder CEO, how are you managing this team and all the expectations of your investors, your clients, and your employees?
That's a great question. And, frankly, I've had to learn it. I've certainly made a lot of mistakes along the way. And, one of the first lessons I learned back when we were running Instant Cab was, sort of, you have this mental model. All good people, I think, have a mental model of themselves as fair people. But there is this natural bias, particularly in leaders, of sort of implicitly overvaluing your own ideas, right? And one of the things that I learned early on, when you have to, manage 2,700 drivers and, a fleet of electric vehicles in 2013, when you're competing with Uber, you quickly learn that, your team of 13 people, if they were not superheroes, you would not be doing any of the things you're doing, right? It becomes apparent that none of what your company is ascribable in any meaningful way to you. It is the team. And I think that lesson early on, which I frankly learned by making mistakes, is what is sort of the primary thing that that helps me now, right? Because I think we live in a world that is increasingly united digitally, and yet, particularly for transportation, each region has its own needs, right? Whether it's privacy, far more important for Europe and California, but increasingly important for the world, to cultural norms, to user experience. When Uber launched in India, the team had to convince Travis to accept cash, right? Which seemed like the wrong decision, but was absolutely the right one. So these things that there's no way that as a leader you can make the optimal decisions for globally, right? You have to empower your team, and you have to be willing to constantly remind yourself that you've hired them because they are better at their job than you, right? And I think to this day it's not easy, but I think that is, if there's one thing that I think has allowed me to improve as a leader, it is sort of this understanding that I gained again by making the mistakes that hire the best people who are better at their job than you will, and amongst the best in the world, and then listen to them and empower them as much as possible.
Is one of those understandings culture, since the culture in India is different from the culture in France versus, say, California? Is that one of your key things as a CEO, that you really strive to understand culture? So if you're meeting with an elected official, government official, or a client, you understand the unique customs of that culture. So something that might be appropriate in the United States might not be appropriate in another country, but you're fully vetted and understand the little nuances to ensure a really great business relationship?
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the advantages, I feel like sometimes I have as an immigrant, which is, just from the very fact of sort of, going from one culture to a completely different culture, makes you more attuned to the differences, right? Including particularly the strengths. And again, I think there's a different culture on the East Coast versus the West Coast. And also, growing up in India, people say India is actually 26 different countries, and there's certainly hundreds of languages. So the fact that India is so diverse and cosmopolitan sort of helped me a little bit. So and in the end, I think it is something that we have to constantly remind ourselves, because there are sort of the cultural norms which may be well understood, and then there's this entire emerging culture and a set of norms around everything from social media, like we were just discussing earlier, to before the podcast, to privacy. It is interesting, right? As somebody who has like Ring cameras all over my house, and I buy every gadget that is written that I can hack, to going to several countries in Europe where a dash cam is actually illegal for a fleet to use. It's a very, you have to understand sort of the history and why, they think the way they do. And, it makes complete sense, right? So that certainly, I think, being attuned to and enabling sort of your product to serve those different cultures, and even actually creating the decentralization so that, each team in each region, even if it's a small team, can influence, the platform, the product in a way that meets their needs. I think those are crucial in our world today.
That line of thinking in leadership prepare you for, let's call it the curveball that was COVID, that nobody saw coming, that you were well prepared for a global organization where different countries have different responses to COVID, as we're currently seeing, where it's not a one size fits all, and then you're trying to manage teams on multiple continents. Was it that clear understanding? And I want to go on the record and say you have a deep love for books and reading. When from all that learning that you're doing, was that like kind of leading up to this moment of leadership that you excelled at?
Look, I would love to say have excelled at leadership through COVID, but I think time will tell. I can say that Ridecell has made tremendous strides, not only despite COVID, but through COVID. We've just raised another $45 million round, and the credit goes to the team. But I think if there's one thing that I think has helped us, come out of COVID stronger, and look, our business and our customers' business has absolutely been impacted, right? Many, sort of in a pretty negative way, but some in a very positive way. And I think what has helped us is our core value. What I talked about earlier, the obstacle is the way. We have a team that I think was visionary enough that, in 2018, we had already, when we started out, with shared mobility, working with, car sharing fleets, ride sharing fleets. But, we started with a vision to help increase utilization and help solve the problem for all fleets. And logistics obviously is a vast plurality, if not the majority of the miles driven. And so in 2018, we had built relationships with leaders in logistics like Penske, with leaders in leasing like BNP Paribas, Arval, Toyota. And then we had already started working in 2018 and 2019 with these entities where we were powering. We had gone from being a car sharing platform to a platform that enables digitization of access to the vehicle and the fleets, digitization of monetization, and digitization and automation using data of all the fleet operations. And that expansion, right, of the value proposition to these diverse market segments is what put us in a very good place, where when COVID hit, one of the key things that needed to happen was, if you are a diverse logistics organization or a leasing organization, with hundreds of thousands of vehicles across Europe or America, even if one of your locations in Atlanta or Stockholm, has to shut down and the people have to go home because, one of your employees, was infected, you still need business to go on, right? And so what happened was digitization became extremely important. In fact, it became sort of critical, and it created this. It was always important for large organizations to have digital access, digital monetization, automation. All this data that's generated, not much is being done with it. It was always important for them to use this data to automate decisions, but it was not urgent for many of them. And what COVID did was it made it extremely urgent. And I think that allowed us to be in the right place at the right time, because we had put in the work to build the relationships, to build the platform, to enable these use cases. And as COVID hit, people ramped up, their adoption.
Is logistics the fastest growing part of your business now?
Yes, I would say both logistics and then more broadly, commercial fleets. The primary realization, if you actually look at the structure of, the largest fleets, and I use the term loosely, right? The largest mobility businesses, in America, you will see Penske Truck Rental and Leasing, also has, Penske Auto Group, right? So the same, set of entities sort of, enable consumer transportation mobility and enable, renting trucks to consumers and B2B, right? The logistics leaders of the world. You look at folks like Toyota, in Europe, and they announced this in January, their vision, which we have helped sort of accelerate, which is a single platform, Kinto, which is not just car sharing or car rental, but is also Kinto One, which is leasing, and Kinto Flex, which is subscriptions and flexible leasing. So I think these entities, the largest commercial sort of mobility companies in the world, that often include fleet leasing companies, sort of are cognizant of the fact that there is a synergy to being able to provide, sort of not only vehicles, but financing, insurance, maintenance to multiple use cases, consumer and commercial. So vast majority of our customers are the leaders in that meta organization. Within that, however, absolutely, I think, e-commerce penetration has, from what I've seen, grown more in the last 10 months than in the previous 10 years. And as a very direct result of that, the need for utilization of these vehicles has grown, right? Not only the number of vehicles, but now, you need to run these vehicles as much as possible. And, it is possible to build a vehicle that can be driven 500,000 miles. Tesla and Tesla sort of have shared some of this data. But to really, what happens is you can have the best telematics in a vehicle, but an average logistics fleet, ends up waiting sometimes a day or two to fix a puncture, because the vehicle is telling the cloud, hey, I have a puncture, but it requires a human being to look at it and a human being to say, well, should I send someone there now, or should I have this vehicle taken to the Penske trucking location? Should I have this vehicle, should I have Bridgestone go over and fix it? And automating that decision is crucial, right? The data is important, but what is crucial is that you can connect this data to a decision making that connects it with the ecosystem, your repair partners, your own employees, your insurance company. And that's what Ridecell does. If one of Ridecell's strongest value propositions is being able to automate the decisions that increase revenue, decrease cost, increase yield, and also, by the way, increase the sustainability. Because if you're not going to need two vehicles to do the job of one, that's better. If you're going to be able to actually use the vehicle 12 hours a day, you're much more likely to use an electric vehicle, because it is far more cheaper to have a high utilization electric vehicle than a diesel vehicle. So, what's good for business is also good for the world.
Yeah, and I got to give a shout out. You keep mentioning Penske to Bill Combs and the team over there, because they're doing great things. And Penske has the largest commercial fleet in the United States of trucks. So they're operating all sorts of really great commercial stuff. And when I look at commercial, I ordered an Apple product today. I had a courier service that delivered my Apple product to my house in 2 hours. It was absolutely amazing. So how can the Ridecell platform help courier companies deliver these faster, more efficiently, so there's not an individual sitting in the parking lot of the Apple store waiting for Grayson to order his Apple product to come to his house, where they can utilize your thing, say, okay, that maybe the Best Buy needs a courier service, which I've gotten in 2 hours, or the home goods store, for example, needs something. How can the Ridecell optimize these courier platforms? Because consumer habits are changing. We've all seen it. And going back to books, I ordered a book from Amazon 2 days ago and it's still not here. And I'm like, wait, this is not normal. I want to read this book now. So how can these companies utilize your platform? And the growing market that I'm seeing where I live is the growing of courier services delivering to your house within 2 hours. Thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think Amazon is a great example. They're absolutely the leader in e-commerce. And it's interesting, right? If you look at some of the top e-commerce companies in the world, whether it's here in India, Amazon, in the United States or Europe, it's interesting. They have ramped up. From public data, I think Amazon has ramped up from almost zero to tens of thousands of last mile logistics vehicles in a matter of 3 years, right? And as a result, what happens when you do something like that, and not speaking specifically about Amazon, but generally, is you end up, sort of with systems that have been scaled rapidly, but where you still might need to literally install key cupboards so drivers are not losing keys, because a lost key is 300 packages not delivered, including Grayson's book, right? You end up with a world where you can have the best telematics in all of your tens of thousands of vehicles, but a human being in Seattle or Stockholm might need to look at the data to say, what should I do? Is this vehicle punctured? Does this have a Bridgestone tire or a Continental tire? And I think what Ridecell does best, right, is it digitizes that entire process. So there's no key cupboards. The driver can just walk up, touch a card or phone, unlock the truck, and go. If the truck has a problem, they can switch it, leave that truck on the side of the road. The next person who comes to fix it can access the truck. But most importantly, though, we take all the data from amazing telematics companies, whether it's the Denso or directly from the vehicles or Geotab, and we are able to take this data and make sense of it. Instead of just ending up in a database, we're able to automate the actual decision so that if there's a problem with the truck, it's back online in 6 hours instead of 48. And in doing so, we are enabling the available sort of capacity for utilization, right? It's almost like adding, an average e-commerce vehicle has 4 punctures a year, right? It's not uncommon for a vehicle that has a punctured tire to take 48 hours from the time it's punctured to the time it's fixed. Not, because it might take 24 hours just to figure out, or 12 that the vehicle was punctured. So when you reduce that, when you reduce just that one issue of a punctured tire, you're saving 4 days per year of a vehicle. Now, I keep referring to this punctured tire example because it's something we've all experienced. But just imagine how many different systems, right, a modern vehicle has. By automating these decisions, by digitizing access and the entire process, with fleet management, integrated into it, with telematics and your telematics vendors integrated, we are able to almost create 20-30% more supply without having to deploy more vehicles. And I think that is key to being able to scale up these fleets and these deliveries in a way that is sustainable for traffic, for pollution, and financially.
It's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. From the business standpoint, you're going to get my ESG rating up. You're going to increase my profitability. And now I want to go to the driver side. So let's say I drive for, let's say, Acme Delivery Company, and they have a fleet of vehicles or vans. And I open up, Acme Delivery driver app. I open it up and says, okay, I'm going to go in vehicle 1. Nope, sorry, it has let's say it's low on oil. And I say, okay, Grayson, you're going to go in vehicle 2 today, and this is where you're going to go. So you digitize the whole process for me as the driver as well, so I know exactly, or if I'm going down the road and let's say maybe there's an engine issue or something that might have to alert, they can say, okay, Grayson, go back to Acme Transfer Hub. We're going to put you into a new vehicle to save that downtime, to keep the process running so I can keep earning a wage. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely. We enable the driver to be able to access, the end user to be able to access everything digitally, from being able to sign up, in less than 2 minutes, providing, your driver's license, your commercial driver's license, doing a background check and digitizing that entire process, to being able to walk up to a truck, doing your walk around without having to, meet someone and sign a piece of paper, to getting in the vehicle, driving away. With our partners like Denso, we can even personalize it. So, when you get in the vehicle, it has the right temperature, it has the right music. So this, I think, and this is where, I see a lot of potential with our partners like Sony or LG. And I think so I think it's super important, right? Because what that does is it reduces friction, right? If you have to go to a logistics or, a truck or a car rental place, even if they pick you up like our friends at Enterprise do, if you have to wait in line for 15 minutes, that's such a suboptimal experience. And right now, in particular, it's risky, right? So I believe the world is moving to where, whether it's B2B or B2C, clearly people want to be able to just walk up and access what they want, right? And this is what we enable.
It's brilliant because I'm going to go back to being a driver now. If I'm in a hot environment, you have the air conditioning on. Let's say I'm in the mood to listen to Bob Dylan. You got Bob Dylan on. I'm happy. And this ties directly into Shopify's The Future of E-commerce reports they published in January 2021. Brands must adapt or risk becoming irrelevant. You're adapting, you're creating value for the fleet owner, the holding company, whatever the entity might be, and for the driver. What new trends are you going to stay ahead of? Because you're already ahead of both sides of the trend, and something tells me you're going to be ahead of the next trend that's going to evolve.
Yeah. So I think the explosion of sort of data, right, has sort of been much talked about. But a whole lot of data, for example, data coming out of the vehicle is not being used, right? And I think one of the new trends that I see, the world really needing to take advantage of, we now have ADAS in larger number of vehicles, right? There are so many more sensors, on the vehicle, but when you look at what does it take to help a vehicle just be smarter, right? Autonomous is absolutely where we should be aiming. But even just to be able to say, how can I help this person drive this vehicle more safely? One of the challenges in improving the algorithms is there's so much sensor data, right? So whether it's data from telematics about tires and tail lights, or it is data from ADAS systems and lidar about how someone is driving, all of this data ends up on a hard disk or in a data center, and a human being needs to parse through it with great amount of time and trouble to be able to make sense of it. And one of the things that I think is absolutely going to happen, and the team at Auro who joined us 3 years ago and is now part of the Ridecell team is working on, is extending our data automation platform to these sensors and the ADAS sensors. We have a prototype called Nemo, where we are able to automatically identify these scenarios and enable them again to be actionable, so that you don't have to parse through hours and hours of lidar and video data to be able to find the interesting scenarios. I think what is happening now is we finally have both the ability as an ecosystem, and I think the need, sounds odd to say, but thanks to COVID, to be able to use all this data and really create value out of it for ourselves and the world. And I think a number of trends, whether they are in sensors and autonomous in fleets, are going to stem from this evolution.
And that's a valid point that you bring up, because in the press release announcing the 2017 acquisition of Auro Robotics, you say the following: the Auro acquisition and the launch of our autonomous operations platforms represents the next phase of our strategy to provide a complete autonomous solution for Ridecell customers. What is the complete autonomous solution?
Yeah, I like to say, it's interesting, right? If you had a magic wand and you could wave it, and all of Uber and Penske's trucks could turn autonomous, most of us think it would be the best thing in the world, right? And it would. Although today, each one of those vehicles, whether it's a Penske truck or an Uber car, comes with a free human being inside who goes out and pumps fuel or charges the vehicle. If someone spills popcorn all over the floor, they clean it. So the moment you take the person out, great, the vehicle is driving itself, but someone's got to make the decision on what to do if my son spills popcorn all over the autonomous car. And how's that going to work? It's going to be a camera that Sony or LG or Denso make, and algorithms that look at the popcorn and say, oh, something is wrong. I can't send this car to Grayson, but do I need to send it 15 miles away for deep cleaning? No, I can probably just send it to the neighborhood, car wash. And that automation, right, is key. So the team at Auro, and what we mean by autonomous operations is a pun. It is the ability to make all of the operational decisions around your fleet, both driven and autonomous, without having to have a human being involved. And by the way, to be able to do it for a fleet of autonomous vehicles. And this is what we have been working on for the past several years, and I think the time has now come where most fleets that are high utilization cannot really scale that up further without this.
You're correct, because we were talking about what I call the non-sexy part of the business.
Indeed.
Your son spills popcorn, my daughter spills a lemonade. Or if somebody's out at a bar and they had too much to drink and they vomited in the vehicle, you've got an issue. And it's stuff that has to be solved. It's going to create immense business opportunities. And when we look at the business of autonomy, there's converging business models. Some individuals think it's purely in trucking. Some individuals think it's in robo-taxis. And you think it's in the platform, and I think you're right, because you had your bet either way. What is your take on the future of the autonomous business models? Do you think that we've achieved a profitable model yet? Or are these companies still going to have to find their path to profitability?
No, I think, as John Krafcik says, I think it's going to be a grind, right? It's certainly not, sort of the press releases, the headlines that I think were too optimistic that, maybe 5 years ago. I do think that, the economies of scale are beginning to work, right? The SPAC phenomenon is interesting, but what it has done is it has sort of made it possible now to create, to potentially create much cheaper LiDAR. I think you're going to see costs come down for real right now. in a meaningful way for a lot of these components. Also, I think in being able to adapt some of these components like lidar for non L4 L5 use cases, we have created more economies of scale. So I do see consistent progress. I really appreciate for example the low key keep your head down and make progress approach that the companies are taking now, with Waymo leading the way. And I think that is the path forward. I do think use cases around logistics are have a number of things going for them, right? The revenue per vehicle is much higher. In some sense, particularly driving on freeways, the problem is much easier. And so I do think logistics will be there, and specialized use cases, right? Like Gatik have an edge. I also think that L5 is a long time away, and L4 as a hard path ahead of us for profit.
What Gaham and the team at Gatik are doing is awesome. I'm a big fan of Gatik. Their Walmart partnership is brilliant. His dedication to the middle mile is brilliant. When you look at this, and he's doing a really, really good job. And I look at robo-taxis and I look at trucking. Is the key to this fleet optimization that will allow these companies to scale? So if you have a truck, say, going from Dallas to Houston, the time the truck's going to come in to the time it takes to unload, so you can optimize that. And then if you're going to go, say, from Buckhead to downtown Georgia to see an Atlanta Braves game, you can optimize that because you understand how many minutes it takes for somebody to get out of the stadium, what the traffic patterns are, and you're allowing that fan to have that great experience and optimizing it. So you're cutting down on pollution and you're optimizing everything. Is that the key to enabling this fleet optimization?
I would say, a little bit broader than that. I think the key is to integrate the ecosystem. One of the key learnings for us, right, and sort of this whole thing has been, it takes so many different, sort of partners and entities, ranging from, your tier one suppliers, the Denzos, the Continentals, the LGs, the Hellas of the world, to, the OEM that makes the vehicle, to the telematics provider, to, the folks that clean your vehicle, to Cox Automotive that, does everything else, to your, to Salesforce, and your CRM company to generate the demand, to AWS and Microsoft to provide the cloud computing, the insurance companies, Munich, Allstate, so that, you're pricing risk correctly, Sony and LG for entertainment, Mitsui for the smart city. So when you look at, how many different businesses it takes to make a profitable trip, it is shocking that the digital connections between these systems have not existed, right? So I think the broader version of fleet optimization and operations is ecosystem optimization, right? So our platform, and this is obviously I am giving you my own spiel, but it is, I absolutely believe that whether it is Ridecell and hopefully a lot of other people or someone else, the core problem is to not let data live in silos so that decisions are made in an inefficient way. The core thing is to connect the data from the vehicle, from the tier one supplier and the OEM to your ops partners and the tire providers and the Coxes and the insurance companies and your cloud computing providers and your CRM system. And the magic of a profitable trip is taking data from 17 different places and automating decisions and then sending orchestration decisions back to 17 different places. And I think we already see this happening, right? We see this in the numbers with our customers. And I think this will become even more true in an autonomous world because the ecosystem is more complex there, right? But I'm very excited because what I see that wasn't there maybe even a couple of years ago is this alignment, this sense of urgency in all parts of the ecosystem, right? From the OEM to the tier one, and paired with sort of a sense of realism where we are not just sort of marketing L5 vehicles will be here in 2 years kind of thing. And so I think in any ecosystem, when you see optimism paired with realism and a sense of urgency, security was here I think in the early late 2000s when I worked in it, and I see that very same sense in the mobility and the autonomous ecosystem right now.
I thank you for bringing up the partner ecosystem because you're 100% right. Somebody's going to want to watch a movie in there. They're going to want to order food or have stuff. It's going to work with partners. And the way that you're developing the Ridecell ecosystem kind of fits with the name of this podcast because you're on the road to autonomy. You're going to enable all of these transactions to happen in the vehicle. And I believe the holy grail, which is going to be the next battleground, is going to be in-vehicle commerce around experiences. And Ridecell has the platform to enable Acme brands to go and do that. And Aarjav, as we look to wrap up this wonderful conversation, what would you like our listeners to take away with them about Ridecell and the future of mobility?
Absolutely. I think we think of Ridecell as sort of the connective tissue that can enable the rapid expansion, in new mobility, which now includes not only the car sharing and the ride sharing leaders, but also logistics. I think as a world, we sort of have this unique opportunity right now where a crisis has created the alignment that we need in order to create fleets and mobility businesses that are not only profitable, but they're also sustainable, right? Where because the high utilization vehicles are better off being electric, even from financial perspective, if we can align the ecosystem and the decisions, we will end up with a world that's far better for our children. And I think what we want to do, right, is to work with our customers, the largest fleets in the world, to work with our partners, to be able to digitize access to the vehicles, digitize monetization of these vehicles, and ultimately automate decisions and operations for these fleets, for these mobility businesses in a way that helps the world move better, right? It's not only more profitable, it's more sustainable. And I would love to hear from any one of you who's interested in this, especially if you are a fleet or a partner or somebody who wants to work with us and help this mission in some way. So I'm aj@ridecell.com, aj@ridecell.com.
That's perfect. And get in cut with Aarjav because he knows what he's doing. And Aarjav, a world that's far better for our children is a world that's a great place. And a peaceful world and a happy world is a great place. So thank you so much for coming on the Road to Autonomy podcast. The future is bright, the future is autonomous, and the future is optimized mobility. Aarjav, thank you so much.
Thank you, Grayson. It's been a pleasure as always. And to everybody who's listening, stay safe and take care of each other.
Thank you for listening to the Road to Autonomy podcast. If you've enjoyed listening, please rate, review, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Want to get in touch? Follow us on Twitter @Road to Autonomy or email podcast@brulteco.com. The Road to Autonomy is produced by Brulte & Company. The views and opinions expressed on the Road to Autonomy podcast do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of Brulte & Company. The content discussed in this podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be taken as legal, tax, investment, or business advice.